Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
To all who shall see these presents, greetings. On behalf of Marine Corps University, the Marine Corps University Foundation, and the Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare, welcome back to the Brutecast, our series designed to connect the worlds of the warfighter and PME with the best in innovative and creative thought. I'm your host, Major Nate Janikin, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center. Before we begin, please remember that all opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, United States Marine Corps, or any other agency of the U.S. government. So at this point, we are now 2 months since the October 7th attacks, and it seems an interesting day for us to be recording as well, as it's the 82nd anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor, and there were several comparisons between the two events. For various reasons, it's been a while since Dr. Tarzi and I have gotten a chance to sit down and record, and a good deal has happened since then. So let's get into it. I think two of the biggest events, not necessarily biggest events, but one of the big events to talk about would be the ceasefire that happened right before U.S. Thanksgiving, or kind of over that U.S. Thanksgiving holiday weekend for here in the States. And then the other thing that I kind of want to touch on was the Houthis along the Red Sea conducting several attacks. Both they did a very successful, what we would call VBSS, or Visit Board Search and Seizure, that seemed very organized and definitely practiced based on the videos that they put out. So, sir, welcome back to the podcast. Thanks for taking the time out of your day. And with that, I do want to turn it over to you real quick to see if you have anything you want to start with.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. I think that I'm glad that you touched upon the ceasefires and the hostages that were released and the Houthi attacks, both the boarding of the ship and also the drone attacks. We will expand on that as the reaction both from our own country, from the United States, and the reaction from both the Houthis and the Iranians, which I think what has happened is, while this war has remained contained more or less within Gaza, it has received more and more a foreign dimension. There's more Hezbollah involvement, a much more robust attack by the IDF, by the Israel Defense Forces, just yesterday on Hezbollah targets. According to the Israelis, attacks on Iranian targets in Syria, attacks on U.S. installations in Iraq, and retaliation. So I think there's a expansion of the conflict on the periphery, not fully, but at least on these attacks that have happening, which have in my view, has a potential of taking this out of at least the immediate region of Gaza. The other thing, of course, that I want to mention is also the expansion of Israeli military operations. When we last talked, they were conducting operations only in north of Gaza, up to that wadi, the river. It's not the river, but yes. So, and now the expansion, I mean, right now they're in Khan Yunis, and they have had operational, mainly air so far, but in Rafah, which is as far as you can go, because Rafah sits right on the Egyptian border, so the southern tip of Gaza. So there's an expansion of operations. There's a lot more ground from the IDF's own information, ground operations of searching for weapons, searching for tunnels. So this has also changed the nature of it, partially because Israel is more in command, but partially also and this is another thing, is there has been criticisms, including from the United States at the pretty high levels, or concerns, I would say, more concerns rather than criticism from the US, but criticism from other countries on civilian casualties. So I would say that is where we are standing right now, and we can go on from there and add to those things if you would. I just wanted to drop that in addition to what you started the conversation.
Yeah, I think one of the things I saw yesterday was it was either yesterday or the day before. There was a press conference from one of the higher ranking members of the IDF talking about how they were beginning phase 3 of the ground operation, which I think is what you're talking about with that um, the continued push towards the south. I think what'll be interesting there is, and I think we talked before, but it's pretty much heavily populated all throughout the strip, right? There isn't necessarily areas where it's less populated than others in the Gaza Strip.
Yes, that is correct. The strip is very small, but there are four major, if you would, cities, and then there are people pretty much everywhere. And you have Gaza City, which is the northernmost, and Khan Yunis, Rafah, uh, and these are the three if you go down from north to south. And the issue is that why they're more populated is because Israel initially had asked and warned, and they were obeyed to support Hamas and allow some people to go, but many people moved south. And there are enclaves that Israel had declared humanitarian zones, basically, that they would be immune. But there are more people. So if you look at pre October 7 attacks or today, the demographics in Gaza has changed dramatically because initially, since the first two phases of the operations were primarily, there were some attacks, mainly aerial operations elsewhere, but they were mainly concentrated on northern Gaza. Now, with the expansion of what you call the third phase, it's more, search and seizures. Uh, they just displayed yesterday some cache of pretty robust weaponry. Apparently, some major senior Hamas leaders, including the most senior Hamas leaders' house, has been now. There's fighting going on, so it's much more maybe close combat, but also the fact, as I said, that many people from the north has also moved south. They're not going back north because so they're there. So there's more people, more dense than what Gaza was. So we don't have a scientific numbers of what's going on there, but if you take a census today, it will be much more people to the south than to the north. So the difficulty of making sure that the collateral damages is less becomes more pronounced. And I think so that's something to add because for Israel, as Secretary of Defense Austin said, there has to be, looking back at the U.S. operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, that the center of gravity is the population. If the population is becomes part of the combat zone, then you drive them, at least what the secretary suggested, it drives them into the arms of the enemy, and that could be a tactical victory in such a killing a leader or destruction of certain assets within Gaza. I've expounded on this. He didn't say that. But at the same time, he said that would be a strategic failure. And this is important for Israel at this point. And I think since today, this is actually exactly two months from that very horrible day, is how, and I think this is something else that maybe in this conversation we can at least open. This is the longer term, is what is the strategic goal of Israel? I think right now, I have said it from day one, even from the beginning, that there has to be a parallel track as this war goes on for the destruction of Hamas and in securing Israel. What does the final goal look like? And that is a strategic objective. There's a tactical objective, and I think this is the time that because as all of Gaza is becoming accessible to IDF operations, then what? And that question is becomes more and more pertinent as the phase 3 operation goes forward. Again, responding to that is that's the 900-pound gorilla, as we say here in the United States. That's the big question. what is the goal after? Let us say Israel, as I've said it before, is fully successful in eliminating most of their targets, individuals, and infrastructure, and get more hostages, hopefully, freed. Then what? So
Yeah, I was just looking at as you were talking through the major cities there in Gaza, and I was just looking at, as you push south, not only does it stay, heavily populated, and just like you said, they've been having everybody continue to move south towards that border with Egypt, but the area there also opens up as well, so you get more area to cover with more people, and it almost seems like the IDF might have made their job a little bit more difficult in the South, having everybody push that direction. But I don't know what other response they could have had in order to try and minimize, civilian casualties without telling folks, hey, you need to go south. Um,
yeah,
I
well,
think,
it's a very difficult operation as we discussed it first. Yes, Gaza is more like a bottle. It is wider in the south, and then it narrows down. So the northern part is the narrowest part of the. You're looking at, if you look at it from east to west, it's much narrower than where it hits Egypt, the Sinai Peninsula. But again, it's a very small operational zone, and what you're going to do that. There are many suggestions thrown around, and I'm not going to go and talk about what to do. There's also right now a lot of tension between Israel and the international bodies, specifically the United Nations, which makes the job of moving forward, humanitarian and also political, more difficult. And these are things that I put these there because uh, that parallel line of diplomacy and final option, the strategic victory, if you would, it becomes more difficult when Israel seems to be alone, uh, not alone, but not supported as much by the international bodies, it seems. So all of those are issues that as we move forward, it becomes military, absolutely, but it also the humanitarian aspect is already there, but it also becomes more of a political game. Also, you hear information right now. There's a lot of discussions about the distribution of aid, and even the aid that comes in. Hamas, again, this is according to what you hear in the news, is that people of Gaza are complaining that they know that aid is coming, but Hamas is taking it to the tunnels, literally and figuratively, that it doesn't distribute to the people. And if that is true, uh, again, it could be Hamas's way of first hoarding food and supplies for themselves, but also depriving the people. Because again, if the objective is the people, if they are the main winning or losing of this battle, if you make them more angry, how many of them get angry at Hamas, and how many of them will become more? So, so unfortunately for the people, for the population right now, they're becoming. Uh, they will suffer because not just because there's a war going on, that's obvious, but also that Hamas is not helping by any stretch of imagination. Early on, one of their leaders did an interview with the Arab media, and he said, "Well, these tunnels are for us." The question was why you do not allow civilians to use these to move or to take shelter. He said, "That's not for this is for us civilians in Gaza. Most of them were refugees, and that's job of the UN." That was his answer, but he was sitting in one of the Gulf countries. So they are using other human shields or as pawns in trying to make sure that that center of gravity, if we would, is becomes more and more frustrating. And the more frustrated they become, they have more recruits, and they get further away from a political solution, which Hamas never wants. Their political solution is destruction of Israel. This is very important. They don't have. This is not an organization says, "Okay, I want a seat at the table," or "I want more land," or "I want the status of this or that." They they're, they're very much a maximalist, no Israel, and that's their charter. That's what they go for.
And talking about Israeli objectives, having that alternate track of what is the end game. We've talked about it in the past that when we went into Iraq and Afghanistan, like our end game that was certainly wasn't as established as it needed to be, and probably we spent more years not thinking about it than we spent thinking about it, sort of. But the only things we've really heard from Israel are the destruction of Hamas and the return of um, the hostages.
Yes. Again, let's say that happens. That question, I think you and I discussed that first or second of our conversations. Then what? And that question is important to be raised, not that to be answered. The answer is not going to come today. Somebody, people who are involved in the Middle East or any other conflict, whether Vietnam, let's stop on that and go to you raised the Pearl Harbor and that notorious day in our history. I think the difference of American foreign policy, and this is good for I am in a professional military education situation. We look at this is why we do sometimes war gamings. We learn history not just to say, well, Napoleon was a great general and with this general or that admiral were good or bad. It's overall political and strategic decision making. The United States of America in World War II had a very, very clear and objective, strategic, and we met it almost to perfection. Some people say the dropping of the atomic bombs was overdone. I will not go on that debate, but the idea was not to make Japan a state of the United States. It was to make Japan a non-belligerent, also to make Japan a positive member of the international community. And Henry Kissinger, now he's just passed away, so he in one of his books said that the genius of how the United States won the Second World War was that not only we defeated the two enemies, Nazi Germany and the Imperial Japanese military, but we made both of them into two respected, successful helpmakers. They did it themselves, but we helped them. Members of the international community and allies of the United States that have remained up to today. The fact that the United States allowed Japan and helped Japan to come back, we made sure that we secure our country, the state of Hawaii and stuff, but also to make sure Japan did not have the capacity. I mean, the Article 9 in the Japanese Constitution still is there. And that Article 9 was to ensure that Japan does not become a belligerent state beyond its own boundaries. Now some people are rethinking that. I'm not going to go and discuss modern day what is good or bad, depending on what China is doing. But the question is, there was a clear objective. And this is why World War II is a total victory. Yes, there was destruction, there was an atomic bomb used, attacks on our country, but when you look at the objective of the war, I'm not saying war, the conduct of the war, but the idea was it was a political objective was there, it was achieved, and some of them were amazing imaginations that thinking people at the time were able to achieve. We did not have that in Afghanistan and Iraq, but we had certain aspects of it. Killing of Osama bin Laden, removing of Saddam Hussein, whether they were half goals or part of the goals, those goals were there. As you said here, learning from the Second World War or other aspects, and then learning from cases like Afghanistan and Iraq, I think it is important to make sure that because this is not something that it can be put in the ice cube anymore. I think this is the key. This cannot become a frozen conflict for a while again, or a manageable conflict. The word that was used mostly about Gaza in the past several, I would say, years was that it's manageable, and whenever that a upsurge of violence starts rocketing, or suicide attacks or terrorist attacks of other kind, then there will be a punishment period, and then it will settle down, and then you come back. That is over. 7th of October changed that, as did the attack on the United States by the Japanese in Pearl Harbor. It was no longer, okay, we can contain this because now it's hitting our homeland and it's hitting it very harshly. What is the next? So it had to be a rollover, it had to stop. So for Israel, yes, that the power to hurt Israel the way it was done. Now we're seeing atrocities against women. It's just what happened on 7th of October. The horrific nature of this terrorist attack is coming more and more to fore. It was horrible then. As we know more, how much of for Israel, this is going to take a long time for them to digest it, to heal themselves, family for family, human to human, nation, as we talked about the deterrence. I'm not going to that, to reestablish that deterrence. But at the same time, as hard as this is, there has to, in my view, personal view, this is not official, there has to be that parallel aspect to make sure that there is a political situation, because it's right next to their boundaries. This is not some island somewhere, or thousands of kilometers away. So that's I think time to raise that, because I think the military phase may achieve sooner than later its objective. They may not be able to get every single Hamas leader, but most likely they're already saying that they have eliminated 50% of field commanders within the Hamas operating forces. So that's the question. The hostages, again, that's something that goes on there. Why are the hostages, at least the women and children, are not being released? There are some theories about that. That at least from the U.S. side, somebody had mentioned that one reason that ladies are not being released is because they had been, I think there's a speculation that they were sexually abused, and by releasing them, Hamas's denial that there were any sexual attacks against the people, that there's, the evidence is irrefutable, but still, but if they have a living person coming back and say this is what happened, that would be a smoking gun more than what is there right now. So whatever the reason, that stopped, and that's why the hostilities started. And also, Hamas did also initiated firings into Israel, which broke the ceasefire, meaning that they didn't want to continue it more. It wasn't even not just not releasing hostages, but by shooting into Israel, that meant that the mediation by the Arab Republic of Egypt and the state of Qatar at that point collapsed, because hostilities already began. So
Yeah, I think that's an interesting parallel to our relationship with Germany and Japan. Yeah, and I wonder if there's some cultural similarities almost, especially with Germany. I think we learned our lesson a little bit from World War One. We didn't do that rebuilding of Germany, and it allowed for the Third Reich to do its rise. I think with Japan, culturally different, but for almost 100 years before that, Japan had already been attempting to use Western methods within its military, so there were some similarities. When you think about Iraq and Afghanistan, the cultural differences between us and those two countries is
yeah, well, also that's a good
really
question. Is
significant.
Germany and Japan were at the time some of the most advanced countries already. Yes, the system of government was not what was good. That's why they caused the wars and other issues. But Germany already had democracy. Germany had a system of governance. And also, it was not dismantled. This is very important. Whether you look at the administration in Japan or post Third Reich, you know, this is a self-criticism. We already have, beaten that dead goat or whatever many times by the destruction. I know Afghanistan, yes, Afghanistan we started from scratch, but there was an administration, unfortunately we just decided to dismantle it to pieces, and then there was nothing to fill it in. Instead of changing it top down and then releasing the system that was there. So these are all the things that I think behooves those who are working there for the future to look at, not just to be critical of history. Again, as I always say that, it's not to cry over the spilled milk, but let us not spill the milk that we have right now in our hand. There were differences. Okay, yes, there were similarities. But in different cases in Afghanistan and Iraq, I mean, if you look back, there were ways to do it better. We didn't. It's a good time to learn about it. For us, it's one thing, but right now there is a war going on. There's a war that has also the potential of becoming a war of attrition. Israel's history has always been that they do not want to go for a war of attrition. The country is small, the country cannot afford it. It's always been the idea of you go for a blitzkrieg, inflict a heavy casualty and a clear victory, and then you create the security. Again, goes back to that deterrence policy in every single one of them. The longest war of attrition, if you look at it in a sense, was the War of Independence, but that's the state was just being formed. And then of course the war in Lebanon, which the Israelis look back at. It could be seen as a victory too, because Hezbollah stayed back more or less and accepted that idea that there was a very high price to pay for attacking into Israel. But while Israel was in Lebanon, it became a war that it was not sustainable for the Israeli system of war. And this war, the war in Gaza, again, the proximity, the fact that there are Palestinians living also in the West Bank, the fact that there are Israel is, unlike what you said culturally, I mean, 20% of Israel are of Arab Palestinian origin. I'm not saying they're part of this problem. They're actually part of, but they are part of Israel. So culturally, there's much more proximity. It is not something that, yes, Hamas is very different, but understanding of these cultures is there. So this allows for goodwill, allows for, hopefully the expansion of relationship with other Arab countries that are more influential in the region, to build something that is more sustainable. But there has to be, in my view, at least compromises. That's a good word I want to use. Compromises on all sides. Nobody can have the whole pot. Now the question is, of course, the details. The devil's in the details is how you divide. Goes back to square one. And this is why I say you cannot, because of those issues about divisions or who has sovereignty over what part, we have the blueprint of 67 borders with minor changes. I mean, closest we came, as I think I mentioned this, in July of 2000. To build on that momentum and then push it forward. And here's where the Abraham Accord expansion thereof, sustainment thereof, becomes absolutely crucial, because this can't be done by Israel alone. This can't be done by Israel and the United States alone. We do not have the credibility. I'm just be very blunt about it. So it has to have Arab partners in it, not just Arab. It has to have some backing from the Europeans. Israel is very suspicious, and rightfully so, in my view, at least looking at it with United Nations, but it has to have a broader. Israel has friends in the EU, Greece, and then more, France, to expand that, Germany, to expand that base of the future, how the future looks like. And that's I think the other issue. As far as the war is concerned, it could be over sooner than people think, depending on how Israel gets to the targeted people. While it's a disadvantage to have that many people in that small area, also the fact that Gaza there's no way to get out of it right now. So tunnels are there. Of course, the hostages create a big problem. You hear, I don't know if you heard it, I heard it in the news media that there was this idea to pump seawater into the tunnels. They have, yeah, yes. I mean, in these tunnels, if you see the pictures, we are talking about hundreds of miles or kilometers of very sophisticated with bathrooms. I mean, if you see them, they are very, very well designed. They go everywhere to flood them with seawater. But one of the main concerns there was, of course, most likely most of the 137, I think, hostages that are still remaining there will be in danger as well. So there's a lot of that could make this, because Hamas wants this a war of attrition, because by that means that they have not lost. As long as there's a war of attrition, that means that they are still doesn't matter what is the how much the activity is, how the kinetic activity of this war goes on. As long as they launch one or two rockets, and that Israel may get out to stop because they need somewhere to do it. But if they have fighters who can come out at night, who can shoot at Israeli targets, who can shoot into Israel proper, even small number of ordnance, because of October 7th, psychologically, Israeli deterrence is very low right now. Tolerance for attack is very low. It's no longer okay, as it was before October 7th, that, okay, one rocket came in, Israelis, actually, some of them just kind of went in their own lives, so they went to their shelters. Once the sirens went out, went right back to the restaurants or whatever. That is changing, especially in the southern part, because this last time this happened. See, this is the key. Psychologically, there's this idea, okay, what else? Even though some people know that it's impossible for Hamas, right now it's not possible to launch an attack like that with Israel sitting inside Gaza. But these are things that could prolong this, and as the more it is prolonged, the more difficult it becomes for Israel to have the political solution with inclusion of the Palestinians on the ground in Gaza. Because again, I kind of piggyback on that one, the terminology from our, U.S. Secretary Austin is, at the end of the day, the strategic victory is the people of Palestine, Palestinian people, the Gaza people, and how structure comes in and becomes a political structure for them to move forward. That's the key.
Do you think it's easier or harder to do that because there isn't a officially recognized Palestinian state? Going back to our example of Iraq, Afghanistan, Germany, and Japan, those are all recognized sovereign states, whereas the Palestinians don't have a place like that. Does that make it easier or harder?
But that's again, it's the horse and the cart business. I mean, there are countries that recognize Palestine as a state. The UN, they have a non-observant status in the United Nations. The United States has a Palestinian authority, if you would, office here in Washington. It was closed down during the previous administration, and I believe now it's open again. And the EU right now, between the two talks we had, one of the developments was, there's a lot of developments that we can't go in each one of them, but one was two prime ministers of two European countries within the EU, Belgium and Spain, namely, went and the statements they made after they had a talk with the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu was rather critical of Israel. And from what I read in the media, the Spanish Prime Minister even said that if the EU does not want to recognize it, Palestine as a state, Spain might do that. The question again comes in, is it premature to do it right now? Or if somebody asked me, as somebody who did years of this kind of negotiation, to bring that about as part of the deal. You know what I'm saying? That the future, if you have a non-aggressive, this is key, non-aggressive Palestinian entity that is accepts whatever borders is accepted and that doesn't have an aggressiveness potential, i.e., I don't want to say disarmed, but if you go back to the old negotiations, there was a robust police force, but there was no offensive weapons. You don't need, katushkas to keep your own security. And if there's a security guarantee for that entity, I use the word entity right now, political entity, that it is secured by international agreement, by Israeli agreement, but it doesn't have ability to, again, Article 9 of here, you can go back to, whatever people say about General MacArthur. I don't want to create that whole controversy of whether he was good or it, but I'm a fan somehow. Article 9 was genius at the time to make sure that Japan has the capacity of naming it the self-defense force. Again, this won't be exact carbon copy. Nothing is exact carbon copy. Every situation is different, culturally, geopolitically, historically, but ideas can come from the past, from experiences which we collectively were successful or not successful and take. So the idea of a state, yes, you are right, but the idea of a state is the solution that the United States, since President Ronald Reagan has said, we use the word two-state solution. Two-state solution. There was only one time that U.S. U.S. has never left that idea. Okay, there were changes of it on how it looked like or how, but so that word that you said, it's not a state, yes, but the idea would be, the solution would be, and this has to be accepted, of course, also by what is happening within Israel as well. And some people who have written about Israel within Israel is that idea went out in the recent years. That it went further and further away from the idea that Palestine has a chance to be a state under any circumstance. And that, of course, gives more motivation, more power to who, like Hamas. Because if you are in the PA, you're seen as somebody who's carrying on that endless state of inertia, state of unknowing what you are. Because for a Palestinian to get out of, they have passports. Some very few countries give them visas on that. So how they would have gone out, some of them went to Jordan, and Jordanians would give them a passport and they would go out. Or if you invited one, you had to go through a lot of loopholes. So to have those rights, right of sovereignty, but not right of claiming Israel's territories as their own, officially or unofficially. Officially meaning their charter should have, at the PLO charter change, that they accepted Israel as a state, and then they don't have the capacity to attack. So those two things, of course, again, as I said, you will get to two. I don't want to get to the point that is the hardest point. We got through all of that. We collected the sticking points at that time, and unfortunately, Palestinians balked on that. But again, that's spilled milk. Is the right of return and status of Jerusalem. But the idea is accepting the two-state solution by the main parties, i.e., Israel and the majority of Palestinians, the majority of Israelis, because they're a democratic state, how they vote next. And by the Palestinians, unfortunately, that's not there, but a leadership that actually accepts that. This is where I think the influence of the regional countries is crucial to bring that. There's something called the Arab plan, statehood land, if you would, for peace. It may not be perfect, but it's an idea that was put in Taif way back, going back to the 2005, if I'm not wrong, by the then Saudi leader, later King Abdullah, and some people call it Saudi plan or Abdullah plan or the Taif agreement right now. So that is also an idea that full recognition of Israel by all the Arab countries. Maybe a few of them won't jump into this, but all of those are good ideas, but we need to have the conversation above the ground. You know what I'm saying? When you hear it and it's not above the ground, meaning it's not even there, the hope of reaching this goal is not even there. You have to, yeah, I know right now this is a kinetic war zone. And for Israel, they have to do this. But there has to be a trajectory, in my view at least, looking at it from a historical future geopolicy. There has to be a end game. So those who want to move into more normal life have hope, detach themselves from the violent organizations, terrorist organizations like Hamas, and move on to this new thing. So that's my hopeful side of the peace. It's not just peace; it is normalcy. It is somewhere that it allows both sides to have a security that they can live side by side. They can't move. Israel can't move. Palestinians can't move. So how they have to find a way to live.
So I think we'll use that to kind of shift gears and segue. Going off of your comment about, the neighboring countries are going to be big players in helping, end this conflict and find a reasonable solution that everybody can agree with. We can segue that into the ceasefire, which I believe it was Egypt and Qatar, with a little bit of the United States that kind of negotiated that ceasefire, and it was supposed to see more aid come into Gaza, and then there was supposed to be a transfer of Palestinian prisoners from Israel to Gaza, and then from Gaza, a number of the hostages.
Yeah, look, these are the positive. Qatar and Egypt are positive players in this, but then you have countries that are not very positive, who actually are calling for the destruction of State of Israel. Chief among them, of course, is Iran. And let us not forget that what I just said, all this hopefulness, with all the problems within the political circles in Israel and the United States, within the positive countries, all of that within the Palestinian community, the most, to find there are countries there that want Israel destroyed. It's not just Hamas. Listen to the Iranian leadership. Where do you think all these weapons came in the hand of Hamas? Some they created based on models that were given to them. There's no doubt about it. Where the technology came in, where the raw material came from, where the money came from. So you mentioned the Houthis. And this is another aspect of this war that we didn't touch much upon and looked at the peace, which is important. But you also have to be very, very kind of weak collectively again of this thing expanding way beyond the war. I mean, Hezbollah is now becoming more active, although they're still not they're not fully in, but they're, as Nasrallah said in his speech, they're trying to keep themselves alive. That okay, we are here, and Israel is responding more robustly with each time that Hezbollah does more operations. It's still within, they're not coming physically to Israel or trying to come, but they're, conducting operations. But then you say about the Houthis, as the U.S. National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, said in response to the Houthi attack, not on the what you call the VVSS aspect of it, which was very choreographed, and you saw that footage and all how they did that. But the drones that I believe USS Carney shot down, whether they were directed at the U.S. warship or they were they were actually hitting two vessels, civilian vessels, which Houthis claimed that they were Israeli. But according to the U.S. information, there were 12 to 14 countries that had a share in them. So it were multinationals. So those were intercepted. I believe what he said is that, yes, the trigger may have been a Houthi member from Yemen, but this is from Iran. These weapons are brought in by the Iranians. The Iranians denied that. They actually responded that this is laughable, and we didn't do that. The Houthis are on their own. Iran does not have proxies. That may be so, but these are enabled 100%, or not 100%, but mainly by that, and the so-called axis of resistance that Iran talks about, which includes the Houthis, and now it includes it used to be mostly Shia organizations like Hezbollah and the Iraqi Shia, Syria, this pro-government Syrians, and also these groups that Iran created, made up of either locals or Pakistanis and Afghan Shias that they brought in to fight in Syria and Iraq. Those groups, they call them the Axis of Resistance. Now, of course, it has also the Hamas, even though they're not Shia. That these groups are all on their own. But, as I said, the weapons used, Houthis do also show off their missiles and their drones. But they also say it, both the Houthis and Hamas, they thank Tehran for everything they've gotten. So the deniability is there. Iran is very clever. It's always have said, what they called it in the olden days when they attacked, either directly or indirectly, they called it the head in the hand technology, that, you can't find their hand. But at the end of the day, they do not want a peaceful solution in which a organization that's not, in their view, revolutionary or part of this axis of resistance or wants the destruction of Israel to be a partner in peace. Iran does not support the Palestinian Authority. Iran supports Hamas. Why? Again, it's not because of Shia Sunni, because Hamas is keen, or its policy is the destruction of the state of Israel. So while we say about the peace and the countries that are positively affecting them, Egypt and Qatar and others who are doing it more behind the scene, in the Gulf countries, other than Qatar, they're providing humanitarian aid. UAE is setting up hospitals, and so on and so forth. There are countries in the region led by Iran, whether directed or not directly. I don't sit in those meetings, that want this war to continue. They don't want it to expand it into their own territories, but they want it to continue it, and they want Israel to suffer. And these are the ones who celebrated 7th of October, celebrated, and they still are celebrating it. So we cannot be naive and say, okay, well, even if there's a peace process goes on, that these countries and these powers or these organizations, I don't like the word proxy, but call them, you mentioned, I don't want to get into semantics too much, but we use the word non-state actors. What is it? Yemen? Is it a state, a non-state? What is Hezbollah? I mean, they're more powerful than most states there. What they can do, most states can't even imagine doing. They just don't have the capacity. So these organizations, or quasi-governments, or Houthis at least control the capital of Yemen. So they're not, they're not represented, but they are, they are government, at least part of Yemen. Where they're going to fall in, how much they're playing a spoiler role, how much this thing can, even if Israel wants to keep it, which it wants on Gaza and elimination of Hamas right now, if they see Hamas actually being totally eliminated? That's a question that maybe we ponder in the next talk, is, are they going to expand it a little bit more so Hamas gets a chance to survive? Will Israel allow that? All these questions. How many fronts, if there's a second front, which most likely will be in the north, how is that going to affect this? These are questions I'm sure that the military, planners and within the IDF and our own are looking at. But those are issues that go way beyond the what I said that you and I talked about. As difficult as it is, the peace process. It's not that everybody in the region wants peace, and it's just like how to divide this future Palestinian state and how to convince everybody that this is the way. There are some who don't want that. For them, the state of Palestine is the entire country of Israel. How you change that mentality. And what makes it more difficult is these are countries that are sworn enemies of the United States as well. So how are we going to work with that? That's Middle East for you. See, I always say I lost all my hair in this thing. It's always a glimmers of hope, and then that hope disappears. But we stick to those hopes and move forward and see what happens.
Yeah, I think going back to the that VBSS of the Houthis on it was Maritime Vessel Galaxy Leader, that kind of brings up some interesting points in global shipping in general, and just how kind of weird and convoluted the whole thing is. So the ship was British flagged, but it was operated by the Japanese, by a subsidiary company of a Tel Aviv shipping company. And so there was the kind of this roundabout. Oh, and by the way, Japanese operated, but the Japanese say that there were no Japanese crew members on board. So it's being crewed by non-Japanese who are operating it, but it's flagged in England. So it's this very weird kind of, and I think that played out in the news as well, because you got these weird stories about, it was a British ship, and then it was a Japanese ship, and then it was an Israeli ship. And I think there's actually a YouTube channel. There's a gentleman, Dr. Sal Mercogliano, called "What's Going On in World Shipping," and he actually talked a lot about that particular incident and why it's weird and why international shipping does that. But I think that kind of the Houthis clearly targeted it for a reason. It had attachments to Tel Aviv and Israel. And I think getting to your point about proxies and people doing stuff, how much of this is Iran telling the Israelis to do this, or not the Israelis, the Houthis, and how much of it is just the Houthis taking advantage of the crisis in the north, because it kind of sounds like Hezbollah is doing that a little bit too. They're taking advantage of Hamas doing this and starting this conflict. But they have their own goals.
Right.
So starting it.
Both Houthis and Hezbollah are political organizations. Hezbollah is a government in Lebanon. Hezbollah is very powerful. They gained a lot of popularity, if you would, or leverage within Lebanon for a long time. Even those who are not supporting Hezbollah, for them standing for Israel and so on and so forth. Now, after the Lebanese economy is absolutely in shambles, I don't know if you recall the explosion that happens in the port of Beirut, killing a lot of people, which was caused by Hezbollah storing phosphate in a place they shouldn't have. I think it wasn't. And many other things. Their corruption, they used to be seen at least as not corrupt, is causing Hezbollah to lose a lot of political support, including within the communities that traditionally supported them. So they have, yes, they're dependent on Iran for a lot, but they also have their own political objectives. You're absolutely right. Same thing with the Houthis. I mean, they're running Sana'a. The capital of Yemen is in their hands, and they have chunks of Yemen, and they've nobody been able to dislodge them. So they have political objectives. They're a minority. Let's not forget that. But they are right now, they mainly come from very, very, very north. So that's why whether it's Iran directed or not, but Iran enabled. Yes, with Hezbollah, they have also their own, they have an incredible infrastructure of money making all the way to Latin America. You have to go to the, Paraguay border with cigarette smuggling. I mean, they have a network that's very, very, very vast that brings the money into it. So that's one thing. Smoking gun wilderness, as I think, we heard from the National Security Advisor, the trigger for these attacks on the shipping lanes or ships were the Houthis, but who is behind it? Now, the other issue is, can even Iran prevent them? I'll raise that. I don't know. Do they even have a power to, let's say Iran wanted to prevent them? But also, let's not forget, yesterday alone, Iran announced that the IRGC, the Islamic Revolution Guard Corps, had boarded, had taken, two ships in the Gulf. And they were both with foreign crews. One had, I think, not a total of 33. So I don't know how many in each one. I don't have information about where these were flagged. And their idea was that they were smuggling fuel. I mean, they have done it. Remember 2019, how many ships were hit. We still don't know who did it. Shipping prices went up. So shipping ideas is right. It goes back to the state issue. You mentioned right now, I think there are 12 countries that have a state or part of this ship that was boarded by, the UVVSS. In the old days, sovereignty was very clear. A ship carried, any vessel that went into the open seas carried the flag of where it was from. And then when they went to the port of the new country, they added that because they were then under the sovereignty of the host country. That was it. And then, of course, the registrations came in. The olden days, I'm old enough to remember that Panama and the Caymans, and why? Because it was cheaper. You go to Middle East right now, you go to a lot of countries, you see many ships with Vanuatu or Caymans or Bermuda. They never went to Bermuda. There's some holding company that holds them, it manages them. Delaware, many ships, and if you go in the Mediterranean, you see ships, you think, oh wow, so many Americans are here. They all have American flags, but when you look at them, every single one of them says Wilmington on it. Some company in Delaware registers them, and then they lease them or sell them or do whatever. So that's one thing. But then what you say is the sovereignty issue becomes more convoluted when you have a major, vessel and it's being attacked, but it's not who it belongs to. Somebody attacks it because there's an Israeli thing, but there were no Israelis on it, and maybe Israeli funding of this particular voyage have been nil or very minimal. So you're hitting a target of maybe a country that actually you like to. So we're living, in my view, again, this is a much different conversation, in a not post-state, but post-state dominance. We have created the system of the world that Europe runs by on this Weberian state when you do political science or you do military aspects, all of it is based on this idea of state sovereignty, boundaries, legitimacy of use of violence, flags. They're all changing. It's right in front of us changing. And our political science, our mode of conduct, military is doing it much more because you are engaging it. But how we explain it to ourselves, how our laws address that, still is not catching up with the reality on the ground. And this is a very important thing when you look at it. This is more for our students, if hopefully they will listen to it. Is as we need to look outside the box. We need to war game situations, not just, okay, this is a rogue guy or this is a proxy. They are entities that are much more powerful than states, and we have to recognize them as such and think about ways and means that we find theories or models that recognize that. That's not giving them recognition or legitimization, but they are realities. So whether you're legitimate or not in the face of United Nations, they don't have their flags fluttering in the United Nations, but that doesn't really matter. Look at Somalia. Somalian flag is a blue flag in the UN. They control a very small part of their country. there are parts of the Somaliland have more security and more investments than Somalia has. They're not a country. I'm not saying it should be or not be, but they're there. So how you deal with that, I think is that we have to address that in order to find solutions. Because if you don't address that and you only stick to what the state looks like on a map that is on my wall there, that's not the reality. And the same thing with the shipping lanes. So I think this is another complication. This is not just Middle East, but unfortunately, or fortunately, unfortunately, other parts of the world, there's piracy going on, but this kind of attacks on shipping lanes is pretty much uh, most of them happens within the waters around the Red Sea, Eastern Med, and the Gulf. Those three areas.
Yeah. And I think we're kind of at the end of our time here. So before we close out, though, I did want to read one comment that was made by the president of Turkey kind of at the end of the ceasefire. So this would have been last Friday. And he said, "We have always emphasized that we are in favor of a permanent ceasefire rather than a humanitarian break. There was an opportunity for peace here, and unfortunately, we have lost this opportunity for now due to Israel's uncompromising approach." And that was his comment at the end of the ceasefire there. How accurate do you think that would be? And then if you want to couple that in with your closing comments, we'll kind of put those two things together.
Well, President Erdogan, of course, he's the president of uh, Turkey, and it's again another very important country. Don't forget that they are also a major supporter of all the factions. Not, there could be a very positive player in here. I don't think the chance for peace is over. Uh, the question here is, this not expecting Israel to respond and make sure that Hamas does not have the ability to do what it did on 7th of October. This is the key. That is Israel has to do that in their own view, and that's something that I think has to happen. What happened on 7th of October cannot happen, and here it's not a political issue; it's an issue of ability to do it. Now, after that, I think to say that there's no chance for peace, I think there is chance. There's always chance for peace. You in Turkey, in my view at least, I'm just saying it from my own perspective, has and can play a major role, because Turkey has influence, is a positive influence. Turkey is a member of NATO. Let's not forget that. And Turkey has a system. It's a democracy. It has a lot of positives there. It has an influence, but that influence can be used in a positive way. And if that aspect comes in Turkey right now, I know the Turkish-Israeli relationships is on a very low web right now, but they have relationships. They have a long-standing, there was a cut in it, relationship with Israel. In that channel, President Erdogan, at time again, there was one time there was a closure because of an incident of Mavi Marmara, which is a ship that was boarded by Israelis, and there was some Turkish citizens killed in that. But that was solved. The fact that it's solved, and I think Turkey has a long-standing relationship with Israel, which, as I said, is in a low web, but that can come back into a high web as part of this effort to bring it about the peace. So that's what I want to say. I want to take President Erdogan's word and say, yes, sir, but there's also, you have a positive role, and they can play it in a much more robust way than most countries in the region. And they have the financial resources, they have the as I said, the democracy, they have a foot in the Western alliance, not EU, but they have a foot in NATO, very important member. So all of that gives them a major role to play should that opening comes in. So I try to, as I say, there's part of me that always looks at that peacefulness of the aspects, because most of these wars all end in some kind of a compromise. Again, Henry Kissinger is dead. just last week. One of the things he's known for, the positive side, is how he shuttled and ended the Vietnam War. At the end of the day, it was, while the war was going on, there was this idea, or in the Middle East, the two things he's known for, and he got the Nobel Prize, is trying to bring the Arab-Israeli conflict at the time to at least a understanding that it wouldn't get out of hand. So while conflict is going on, I think we need that. Going back, so we wrap it totally, is that while the kinetic, while all the issues are going on, there has to be a strategic vision. If we close that, then we have nothing. I think I will end it at that.
Yeah, I think a conversation about Kissinger in the Middle East is a whole different series of a podcast as well. So,
I'm
sir,
not an expert on that. We can find somebody good for it. But
yeah, no, I don't. That's not a can of worms I want to open. So, sir, thank you very much for taking the time out of your day, sharing your thoughts and having this conversation today. Just like every other the episodes we've done in the past, I hope this is the last one, but I know that it won't be. So we'll come back together in the future.
Thank you very much. Bye bye.
Yep. And so with that, that's all we have for today. So go ahead and carry out the plan of the day. Thanks for joining us. As always, we depend on support and feedback from the Team Krulak community to constantly improve our offerings and reach a wider audience. So if you have feedback on this episode, please take a moment to fill out the survey linked in the show notes to help us do better. Also, if you have enjoyed this episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel on YouTube, or leave us a review on the podcast app of your choice. It truly does help us reach a wider audience. Thank you as always for your support, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.